Okay, so right off the bat with this story, the first thing we're looking at is the title, Story of an Hour. So, of course, we know this is a short story. However, it is so short that all of the events we're about to see take place within the course of 1 hour. Another thing I want to point out is that I have my fiction annotating key up here in the corner. We highlight anything that has to do with our characters in pink, anything that has to do with setting in green, anything that has to do with the plot or other action notes in the story we're going to highlight in yellow. And finally, our literary devices are going to be highlighted in orange. So that is going to be mostly our figurative language, similes, metaphors, etc. However, we're also going to have a few other literary devices within the story, such as irony and foreshadowing. So, let's get into it. Knowing that Mrs. Mallard was afflicted with a heart trouble, great care was taken to break to her as gently as possible the news of her husband's death. So, we're getting a couple of interesting things right in this first sentence. One, we're introduced to our main character, Mrs. Mallard. Second, we're learning that she has heart trouble. So, because we know that they're mentioning it to us this early in the story, something with the heart trouble is going to come back later. This is called foreshadowing, when the author drops hints about what is going to happen later in the story. The second thing we're getting is our first plot note. Mrs. Mallard's husband is dead. Let's keep going. It was her sister Josephine, so we're getting another character, Sister Josephine, who had told her in broken sentences, veiled hints that revealed in half concealing. Her husband's friend Richard, another character, husband's friend Richard, was there too, near her. It was he who had been in the newspaper office when intelligence of the railroad disaster was received, with Brentley Mallard's name leading the top of the list of killed. So, a couple of things here. We're seeing broken sentences, veiled hints, half concealing, almost as if they're treating Mrs. Mallard like a child when you try to break bad news to them. Second, we are learning the cause of Mr. Mallard's death. He was killed in a train accident. He had only taken the time to assure himself of its truth by a second telegram, and had hastened to forestall any less careful, less tender friend in bearing the sad message. She did not hear the story as many women have heard the same, with a paralyzed inability to accept its significance. She wept at once with sudden wild abandonment in her sister's arms. When the storm of grief had spent itself, she went away to her room alone. She would have no one follow her. So a couple of things here. Mrs. Mallard does not take the news as other women would have, with like this silent shock. She starts crying and freaking out. She falls into her sister's arms. Is distraught. She's beyond sad. Second thing is our first literary device, Storm of Grief. That's a metaphor comparing her grief to a storm. There stood, facing the open window, a comfortable, roomy armchair. Into this she sank, pressed down by a physical exhaustion that haunted her body and seemed to reach into her soul. So a few things here. We have our first setting note. She's in her room facing an open window in an armchair. And the second thing is this exhaustion that we're getting here. Mrs. Mallard has this exhaustion that's beyond physical. It says that it seems to reach into her soul. So a physical and emotional exhaustion. She could see in the open square before her house the tops of trees that were all aquiver with new spring life. So she's looking out the window, and this is what she sees. The delicious breath of rain was in the air. In the street below, a peddler was crying his wares. The notes of a distant song which someone was singing reached her faintly, and countless sparrows were twittering in the eaves. So, not only is this describing our setting, but we're also getting another literary device, which is dichotomy, which is basically the idea of putting two opposite ideas or concepts next to each other to emphasize each of them. So in our case, we're seeing that the outside setting does not reflect what's happening inside the house. It's a beautiful spring day. Smells like rain. The wind is blowing. We hear someone selling stuff on the street. We hear someone singing. We hear birds singing. Meanwhile, inside the house, we're dealing with the storm of grief and death and bad things. And we'll keep going down here with more setting. There were patches of blue sky showing here and there through the clouds that had met and piled above the other in the west facing her window. She sat with her head thrown back upon the cushion of the chair, quite motionless, except when a sob came into her throat and shook her. As a child who has cried itself to sleep continues to sob in its dreams. So, we have our signal word here, as. We know that that means this is a simile, comparing Mrs. Mallard to a child again. And then we're learning more about her down here. She was young, with a fair, calm face, whose lines bespoke repression and even a certain strength. But now there was a dull stare in her eyes, whose gaze was fixed away off yonder on one of those patches of blue sky. It was not a glance of reflection, but rather indicated a suspension of intelligent thought. So we learn a couple things down here. One, Mrs. Mallard is young. She is strong, but has been repressing herself. And the second thing, our suspension of intelligent thought. So she's in a daze. She's not thinking about anything. There we go. And we'll keep going to our second page. There was something coming to her, and she was waiting for it fearfully. What was it? She did not know. It was too subtle and elusive to name, but she felt it creeping out of the sky, reaching toward her through the sounds, the scents, the color that filled the air. So this is more of our plot notes. Something is coming. Now her bosom rose and fell tumultuously. She was beginning to recognize this thing that was approaching to possess her, and she was striving to beat it back with her will, as powerless as her two white, slender hands would have been. So this is a little bit of a literary device as well as characterization. Again, we're seeing our two signal words here as. So they're describing something emotionally that's coming up inside her. However, her inability to repress these emotions that are coming, they're comparing it to her physical weakness. So comparing her perhaps emotional weakness to physical weakness. When she abandoned herself, a little whispered word escaped her slightly parted lips. She said it over and over under her breath. Free, free, free. So look at what she's saying here. Free, free, free. What do we think that means? What is she free from? This is important. The vacant stare and the look of terror that had followed it went from her eyes. They stayed keen and bright. Her pulses beat fast, and the coursing blood warmed and relaxed every inch of her body. So, the look of terror has left her eyes. She's not scared anymore. Her eyes are keen and bright. These are both words with positive connotations. Her pulses beat fast. Uh-oh. We know she has heart trouble. What's going to happen if her heart starts beating fast? This is a little bit more foreshadowing. And the coursing blood warmed and relaxed. Two more positive connotation words, every inch of her body. She did not stop to ask if it were or were not a monstrous joy that held her. A clear and exalted perception enabled her to dismiss the suggestion as trivial. So we're seeing a change in her. She's becoming stronger. She's not repressing herself anymore. She knew that she would weep again when she saw the kind, tender hands folded in death. So this is more characterization both for Mrs. Mallard and her husband, who, again, is dead. So we're learning that he was a good guy. So she knows she's going to be sad when she sees him dead at the funeral. She's going to be sad, but she's excited to be free. The face that had never looked save with love upon her, fixed and gray and dead. So he was kind to her. Mr. Mallard was kind to her. So he wasn't a bad guy. She just didn't love him. But she saw beyond that bitter moment a long procession of years to come that would belong to her absolutely. And she opened and spread her arms out to them in welcome. However, so she knows she's going to be sad at the funeral. However, she's looking beyond that to the rest of her life as a widow, where she'll be free. She can live her life how she wants. There would be no one to live for her during those coming years. She would live for herself. There would be no powerful will bending hers in that blind persistence with which men and women believe they have a right to impose a private will upon a fellow creature. A kind intention or a cruel intention made the act seem no less a crime as she looked upon it in that brief moment of illumination. So she's reflecting on how when you're in a relationship with someone, you aren't free to do whatever you want. You have this person. You can't just I can't just go out every night of the week and expect my partner to not care. I have to be mindful of them. So that's what she's talking about down here. That even if you have a good intention or a bad intention, nonetheless, you still have this sense of control over another person. However, now that her husband is dead, she knows she will be able to live however she wants. And yet, she had loved him. Sometimes. Often she had not. What did it matter? What could love, the unsolved mystery, count for in the face of this possession of self-assertion, which she suddenly recognized as the strongest impulse of her being? So this is a very different person we're seeing now. She's strong. She's assertive. This is very different from the Mrs. Mallard we were introduced to, who's weak and frail and almost childlike. Free, body and soul free, she kept whispering. Josephine was kneeling before the closed door with her lips to the keyhole, imploring for admission. Louise, open the door, I beg. Open the door, you will make yourself ill. What are you doing, Louise? For heaven's sakes, open the door. So, the sister is worried that she's upset. Go away. I am not making myself ill. No, she was drinking in a very elixir of life through that open window. So we're highlighting this in orange. This is another example of a literary device. This is situational irony. We would expect after your husband dies that you would be upset and sad about it. However, she's not. So because this is the opposite of something we would expect to happen, that is why it's situational irony. So we have a little bit more at the bottom here. Her fancy was running riot along those days ahead of her. Spring days and summer days and all sorts of days that would be her own. So she's imagining the whole rest of her life. She breathed a quick prayer that life might be long. It was only yesterday she had thought with a shudder that life might be long. So now we're seeing that she's excited for the rest of her life. And she's imagining all of the things she'll be able to do now that she's free and she can live for herself. She arose at length and opened the door to her sister's importunities. There was a feverish triumph in her eyes, and she carried herself unwittingly like a goddess of victory. She clasped her sister's waist, and together they descended the stairs. Richard stood waiting for them at the bottom. So, this is, again, very different than how we met her. She's triumphant. She carries herself upright like a goddess, as opposed to being frail and childlike. But all of a sudden, someone was opening the front door with a latchkey. It was Brentley Mallard who entered. The dead husband. A little travel-stained, composedly carrying his gripsack and umbrella. He had been far from the scene of the accident and did not even know there had been one. He stood amazed at Josephine's piercing cry, at Richard's quick motion to screen him from the view of his wife. But Richard's was too late. When the doctors came, they said she had died of heart disease, of the joy that kills. So we're wrapping up with our other literary device. This time, dramatic irony. So the doctors are saying she was so happy that her husband was alive that it killed her. However, we, the audience, know the truth, that she was happy that he was dead, and she was excited for her life, and as soon as he comes through the door, all of her hopes for the future were shattered. She was devastated. And we know that that is what really killed her.